Thanks very much, April. Um, as you said, my name's Elise. I'm a registered nurse in Ottawa, and just for context, I'm in full PPE under mandate to isolate at work. So you can't see me smiling, but I am. I really want to extend my heartfelt thanks to everyone who's worked so hard to prepare the webinar today and to learn more about the Indigenous relationship to water with our amazing speaker, Rachel. And I join you from Ottawa, and I would like to acknowledge that this is the place where I make my home and life, and that it rests on unceded Algonquin territory. And in our reflection today on water, including watersheds, I'm in the Ottawa watershed, that the name Ottawa is derived from the Algonquin language, meaning to trade, and that the Algonquin people controlled trade of the river, and it was a primary highway through their territory. So the name Ottawa was first applied to the river and then to the city. I want to share a little bit about Ontario Nurses for the Environment Interest Group, or ONEG for short, the group of which I am a part and that helped to put together the webinar today with Sila. So we represent over 2,000 registered nurses and nursing students who are passionate about health and environmental issues. We're all volunteers, and we come to this group through a membership in our professional association through the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. Our members are from all over Ontario, and as a leader in this group, I have the opportunity to hear directly from our members. And as we've worked over the last year to advocate within our professional association for advocacy on water protection as a priority, and Jocelyn will talk more about the specific initiatives, I've had the opportunity to hear about experiences of our members, and one that really struck to mind, or has stuck to my mind, is from a pediatric emergency room nurse in a large urban center, and having been really struck by caring for a child with gastrointestinal illnesses that were caused from the poor quality of water on a reserve not far away from that center, and which there wasn't an advisory notified to the caregivers. And it really hits home the disparity in access and the need for this as a priority. So the work with ONEG is to bring the unique voices that nurses have to advancing healthy public policy. And really, I think the hope in these webinars for me is to listen, and how we can use our voices and opportunities as nurses to support needed changes and to understand more in our responsibility and reconciliation. And I'll turn it over to you, Jocelyn.
Thanks so much, Elise, for giving that background. And I'm just going to give a quick background about the webinar series and how we kind of came to this work as well. And it really came to the forefront last year when there was some legislation in Ontario that was coming through that we saw threatened some of the water protections. And so we put together a resolution as an interest group to our parent organization, the RNEO, Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. And that received nearly unanimous support from our membership. And we really were hoping and plan to use this resolution to bring resources to education, advocacy, and really bringing recognition to the right to safe water and sanitation as well. And one thing I wanted to mention too is that we wrote this resolution to be led by Indigenous peoples who have really long been water protectors and advocates for this important resource that supports the well-being of us all. And I wanted to say as well, where I'm coming from is, I've heard from April and Elise as well, and I'm coming from Waterloo, and that is on the Haldimand Tract, which covers 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. And it was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations. And it also is the territory of the Anishinaabe, neutral peoples, and the Haudenosaunee. And so I'm so grateful to share this land. I'm gonna do another quick plug, as April said, for the Q&A feature. So when you're thinking of it, when you're listening to Rachel and hearing her points and some questions come to mind or a comment comes to mind, just pop it right in the Q&A when it comes to you. And we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can after the talk. And finally, we get to the good stuff, which is introducing Rachel here. Rachel Arsenault, she's a doctoral student and in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and at York University. And she's done some great research in the areas of water, climate change, and Indigenous studies. some of the projects that she's been involved with that really focused on the environment and health were a decolonizing water project in BC, and as well as the Healthy Great Lakes project with SELA here. So I just wanted to say we're so grateful that you could come and join us, Rachel, and can't wait for your talk.
Okay, thank you, April, Elise, and Jocelyn. My apologies, someone in my neighborhood picked this exact opportunity to start cutting trees down in their yard. So if I have any background noise, sorry about that. Ani, Buzu, Mino Kajip. Good afternoon, my English name is Rachel Arsenault, and I'm Fish Clan from Weequampong First Nation on Manitoulin Island. First, I want to acknowledge that by being in Toronto, I am on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. For the past year, I have worked with SELA as a member of their Healthy Great Lakes Advisory Committee, and I've learned a lot from working with them and our other colleagues on the advisory committee. It's my first time working with the Ontario Nurses for the Environment, and I'm so grateful that they asked me to work with them on this webinar. First, I'll talk a little bit about my work experience. I have over 6 years of experience working for Indigenous organizations in various capacities. And in September 2016, I began my journey as a Master's of Indigenous Relations student at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. Currently, I'm enrolled in the PhD program in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. But mainly I'll be talking about the research that I did for my master's, as it was focused on water insecurity and First Nations in Ontario. Next slide, please, Anastasia. The research for my master's thesis was focused on the First Nations water crisis and how insecurity is impacting First Nations in the Ontario region. Many Indigenous peoples and communities maintain a spiritual relationship with the land and water, and in some cultures, water is understood to be an animate being. Indigenous water relations differ across cultures, physical environments, and socio-political conditions. The relationship between people and water is often understood to be reciprocal. Just as water sustains human life, humans hold an inherent caretaking responsibility for the waters that they depend on for their survival. My PhD supervisor, Deborah McGregor, describes the relationship that people have with water as the ethic of responsibility. She states that, and I quote, "The ethic of responsibility to water reflects the notion that water is understood as a living force which must be protected and nurtured. It is not a commodity to be bought and sold. Water, according to First Nations peoples, has cleansing and purifying powers. It's the giver of life with which babies are born. It is imperative in our traditions to keep the water clean so it can continue to fulfill its purpose." End quote. Additionally, it's not just lakes and oceans that require our protection, respect, and reverence, but also the rivers, streams, and creeks, which carry water to and from the oceans and lakes. Water is also a significant part of the Indigenous connection to the Creator. The Creator defines the Indigenous connection to all creation, extending to Earth, the plants, the animals, and all people on Earth, including our ancestors and those yet to be born generations. Indigenous peoples call this natural law. Researchers such as M.A. Kraft talk about the natural water law, which she calls, and many other cultures throughout Ontario, and I believe Manitoba as well, the Nebe Inakanagiwin. Kraft describes this, and I quote, as the laws which govern interactions between beings. In the Anishinaabe law, we expand our understanding of being to include life forms, such as animals, plants, rocks, or in other words, anything that has a spirit. Spirits are considered to be beings with whom we interact. Anishinaabe law considers the interactions between and within these beings and understands them to be governed by spiritual, natural, and customary laws. Sacred law is the law that is handed down to us by the Spirit. Natural law is dictated by what we observe in nature and that behavior which we model ourselves by. End quote. In October 2008, the Chiefs of Ontario released the Water Declaration of the First Nations in Ontario. This document clearly articulates the Indigenous relationships to water shared by the 133 First Nations in Ontario. Despite the numerous cultural and linguistic differences for each of these communities, there is a shared relationship to water, a shared requirement to water for animals and for current and future generations, a shared right to water and self-determination, and a shared right to water in treaties. Article 37 of the Declaration reads, and I quote, "First Nations in Ontario have the authority and responsibility as given to us by the Creator. We are going to assert our authority. We have legal rights recognized by the laws given to us by the Creator, the Constitution of Canada, and international law." End quote. In 2013, the Assembly of First Nations followed suit and drafted a national water declaration, which can be found on their website. I wanted to share these concepts and declarations with you to describe the explanation, to describe and explain the Indigenous relationships to water. When water insecurity impacts Indigenous communities, it doesn't just impact us physically, but socially and mentally as well. To start the dialogue on the First Nations water crisis, I always like to begin with a book that Maud Barlow wrote in 2016 called Boiling Point. In this book, Barlow talks about what she calls Canada's water crisis and how many Canadians do not understand that only 6.5% of the world's total renewable water sources exist in Canada. Even myself as a child, I always believed it was much higher. We have rivers, lakes, and streams everywhere. We apparently had so many that we had to bury some under our cities like Sudbury and Ottawa. Not only do we have a mere 6.5% of the world's renewable water sources, but Barlow tells us that only 1/3 of that percentage is accessible to the largest Canadian populations living along the Canada-US border. In 2000, Ontario had a very serious wake-up call for their own water insecurity. And this wake-up call was the Walkerton tragedy. The public outcry that resulted after this water crisis ensured that their water challenges were resolved within the first year of when it occurred, with a public inquiry starting in October of the same year. The second webinar in the series will talk more about Walkerton, but I wanted to introduce the topic to compare it with the crisis in First Nations communities, which began decades before this one. To compare, some First Nations in this province alone have been suffering with contaminated water and under short and long-term boil water advisories, and even some do not consume advisories for decades. With at least 2 communities that I researched having suffered water contamination for 40 years or more. Many other communities have suffered with contaminated water for decades. I'm sure many of you are wondering, like I did when I started my master's all those years ago, how this could happen, and I wanted to share some research findings from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers. The researchers that I relied on the most were Deborah McGregor, Marilyn Fair, and Amanda Classing from Human Rights Watch. Fair and McGregor discussed the existing funding gaps. One of the main gaps is that First Nations only receive 80% of the funding that they require to operate and maintain their systems, and they need to come up with the 20% difference themselves. As a result, many reserves cannot afford to pay for all the costs required to keep up with the operation and maintenance costs, and are forced to cut corners wherever possible, such as paying their water technicians low wages, or even in some cases minimum wage, skimping on the repairs until the water system falls apart, or taking allocated funding for other areas in the community where it's also needed. The result is that many communities have a hard time keeping trained water technicians in their communities because they can make decent wages working for municipalities. And some water infrastructure systems are not living up to their intended life cycles. These are just some of the challenges that I uncovered within my own studies. In the article that I was referring to earlier, The Ethic of Responsibility by Deborah McGregor, she created a timeline of how the federal government began their efforts to mitigate the impact of the First Nations water crisis since 2003. She stated that in 2003, Indian and Northern Affairs assessed 740 water and wastewater systems in First Nations and found that 218, or 29%, posed potential high risks, 337, or 46%, posed medium risks to water quality, and only 24% of the water systems assessed were classified in the low or no risk categories. With these findings, Indian and Northern Affairs invested $600 million to be allocated over several years to repair, replace, and implement new systems where needed. The issue with the investments, and what many don't take into consideration, is that the amounts that actually reached First Nations were not $600 million during that time frame. Marilyn Fair stated, and she cited the Assembly of First Nations as her source, that First Nations actually only received 67% of that funding because of what she calls misrepresentation of money transferred. The remaining pieces of government funding go toward government staff, Indigenous organizations, and other experts which assist communities with these issues. And while I understand that this work is important and in many cases necessary and beneficial, I also believe that stating that communities received $600 million in investments is not quite accurate. The Assembly of First Nations also reported that in 2004, the First Nations communities were only receiving half of the funding than which was allocated to municipalities. Pardon me for a minute. In 2006, Indian and Northern Affairs created an action plan for drinking water in First Nations communities. Part of this work was to establish an expert panel for safe drinking water in First Nations, and they released a report the same year that they were formed. They had 3 key findings. Number 1, that new regulations should be created which referenced existing regulations. Number 2, that federal standards and requirements be established. Number 3, that First Nations be allowed to develop a custom law that would be built into existing regulations. However, Amanda Classing from Human Rights Watch determined that those recommendations would be meaningless without adequate investments being made to remedy the existing problems with water systems. In 2007, the United Nations released their Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which included articles on the human right to clean water for drinking and sanitation. Despite all the previous government efforts and investments and the newly created UN DRIP document to support them, the water crisis persisted into 2008, which was the year that the Harper government came up with their first piece of draft legislation to regulate the First Nations drinking water on reserve. Due to several flaws within the legislation, First Nations in Canada outright rejected the legislation. However, by 2013, the government officially passed the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. This piece of legislation was just as flawed as the first draft in 2008 and effectively absolved the federal government of any responsibility for providing First Nations with safe drinking water and put the responsibility on First Nations communities themselves without any kind of resources attached to that responsibility. This legislation still exists today, but I don't think it's ever been enforced anywhere. The Assembly of First Nations were tasked with working with the federal government and First Nations to repeal this legislation, but at this point, I'm not really sure how far along that they got in that process. This document is also of great concern to many Indigenous community leaders who fear that any injuries to the community members which results from water contamination or sanitation or water consumption, or sanitation could result in them being persecuted in some way or fined. And there are many contaminants which still remain in water systems and some injuries which I will get into next. Next slide, please. There's a community in Northwestern Ontario that some of you may have heard about, and that's Grassy Narrows. Their members have been suffering from mercury contamination since the 1960s. And what some of you may know is that mercury poisoning is transferable to the offspring of pregnant women. They have had media attention on and off again throughout the years, but the reality is that it was decades before any of them were compensated for the diseases that came with the mercury from the mercury poisoning. And for the decades after the spill, they were told that the contamination wasn't that bad and that it was okay to eat the fish. In 2016, Human Rights Watch reported that rashes were appearing on the skin of children who were bathed in the community water supply. Within my own master's thesis interviews, I also heard that at least 2 First Nation community members tell me that rashes appeared on community members which used certain community beaches. In my own community, there's one area in the community where I was told never to swim growing up. I found out in later years that the lack of community planning had poisoned this beach in the 70s and 80s because the landfill site was leaching into the water there. I'm not sure what caused the skin rashes in other communities other than Grassy Narrows in my own community, but I do know that several participants in my master's thesis told me that First Nation community members residing next to lakes had the sewage outtakes from their homes flowing untreated sewage directly into bodies of water, which may also cause those issues. What many people may not realize is that water insecurity in First Nation communities also impacts housing. Communities with water treatment plants operating at max capacity or without access to water in general cannot build new homes. While a lack of resources to build new homes on reserve is also a big issue, the other impediment to housing is water insecurity, which brings us to the current COVID situation. Some of you may have heard First Nations express concern over the overcrowded living conditions on reserves and the lack of water for sanitation. There are documentaries like the one Alanis Obamasawin did on the people of the Ottawa-Piscat River, which demonstrate just how bad the housing conditions are on many reserves. In the documentary, sometimes there are 3 families which would be living under the same roof. and many of the homes which fall into disrepair or homes that should be condemned are still being used in communities because of the housing shortages. Many issues in First Nations are linked to water. There are 2 reports released by the province of Ontario and the federal government, which even demonstrated how the lack of clean water for drinking and sanitation was linked to social issues, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the inquest into the deaths of 7 First Nation youth in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Access to water for drinking and sanitation is one of the social determinants of health. Next slide, please. It is my hope that the federal government continues on their path of eliminating all long-term boil water advisories by 2021. It's also my hope that they look at other factors of water insecurity immediately afterward, such as water treatment plants operating at capacity, supplying communities reliant on water and wastewater trucks with water systems, and adequately resourcing communities to get a better handle on community planning for those communities that don't have community plans in place to protect water and enforce stricter source water protection measures where they are needed. I will be here to answer any questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So we're going to take a look at the